What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, thanks for checking us out. My name is GemmaJade, but today we are going to be discussing the strange disappearances of Felipe Santos and Terrance Williams. I've been wanting to cover this one for a long time too. Normally, when we come across bizarre missing persons cases, we eventually end up at a point where investigators, the authorities, are called in to help with the search and to try and figure out what could have happened to the person or people in question. However, I've come across two missing persons cases that happened in the early 2000s in Florida, where it seems at least one investigator played, allegedly, a more sinister role in whatever happened here. And since neither of the two men have ever been found and are still missing to this day, many people wonder why the person in question hasn't ever been charged with anything, despite glaring evidence that he very well could have had something to do with, again, whatever happened. Keep in mind that the suspect in these cases has never been charged with or arrested in anything having to do with either crime. That's one of the reasons so many people are so confused and wondering what in the world could have happened to Terrance Williams and Felipe Santos, respectively, and why no one was ever held accountable for their untimely and extremely bizarre disappearances. On January 11th, 2004, 27-year-old Terrance Williams was living in Naples, Florida after recently having moved there from Chattanooga, Tennessee in order to be closer to his mother, Marcia. Terrance was a father of four and struggling to keep up with his child support payments for his children, and he thought that there would be more job opportunities for him in Florida. On the night of the 11th, Terrance went to go to a party at a co-worker's house, but he couldn't find a ride. His roommate didn't want to go, and his only option, besides staying home and not going at all, was to drive his own car to the party and back home again afterward. However, Terrance's license wasn't valid because he had recently been cited for driving under the influence. So he was taking a big risk by driving himself around, as he would be doing so illegally. Terrance's roommate was named Jason, and Jason was also his best friend, and when he woke up the next day, on the morning of the 12th, to dozens of missed calls from Terrance, he began to become concerned as to what Terrance could have been calling him for so many times in a row, so early in the morning. When he still hadn't returned home and no one had heard from him 2 days later, Terrance's roommate and best friend Jason Gonzalez emailed his mother, Marcia. It was on January the 13th, and he explained that he hadn't heard from her son since he had last spoken to him on the phone 2 nights earlier at around 11 p.m. when he told him he had gone to a party and had taken his own car there. He told her about all of the missed calls and how concerned he was about what could have happened to her son. Immediately upon receiving the email and speaking to Jason, the Williams family called the police and filed a missing persons report. Not too long after that, Terrance's aunt was able to find his 1983 white Cadillac, the car he drove illegally to the party, and it turned out that the vehicle had been towed for obstructing traffic from the Naples Memorial Cemetery. Marcia went down to the cemetery herself where they had towed her son's car from, and she started asking questions. Employees there told her that they had seen Terrance in the back of a police cruiser on the day in question. Her next step was contacting the Collier County Sheriff's Department and asking to speak to the officer who had signed the order for her son's car to be towed. Turns out this was a deputy named Stephen Calkins. Marcia was able to speak to Calkins, but he insisted that he had not had any cars towed that day and that he had not made any arrests. He denied ever having come into contact with Terrance at all. Marcia immediately knew something was very wrong. As more witness statements started to come in, it looked more and more like someone was lying to her and her family about what really happened to her son. More witnesses kept coming forward, and they all were basically saying the same thing: that they had seen Officer Calkins patting Terrance down and asking him for his information before arresting him, putting him in handcuffs, and placing him in the back of the cruiser. They also said they saw Stephen Calkins return to the cemetery about an hour later, when he moved Terrance's vehicle from inside of the cemetery to outside of the cemetery and into the road, which is where it was blocking traffic. So it turns out, if these witnesses can be believed, and there were many of them who came forward, that Terrance was not obstructing traffic. He was parked inside the cemetery. And I believe that was because, if I remember correctly, he was pulled over and he pulled into the cemetery. Either that, or I think he was possibly saw the cop behind him and he was kind of cutting through the cemetery to evade or maybe get away from the officer, because he did know he was driving illegally, right? I mean, that's something I would do. I'm sure most people, if you had to drive illegally for any reason, or if you just chose to, if you see a cop behind you, you're going to try to evade that situation. The officer left the car in that position and then called for it to be towed. The car keys were later found lying on the ground behind the car. Some employees at the cemetery even remembered Deputy Calkins asking them if it would be okay if he left the Cadillac there, and the employees agreed as they saw he was making an arrest and they wanted to help out an officer. If this was the case, though, then what happened to Terrance, and why didn't Calkins file an incident report that very day? Why hadn't Terrance ended up in jail or otherwise detained? These were great questions, and Marcia incessantly called the sheriff's department every single day, multiple times a day, but each and every time Calkins would tell whoever he was speaking to tell her that he didn't arrest her son, and he had no memory at all of having any vehicles towed that day. After more than a few people had come forward with witness statements from the cemetery putting Terrance in the back of Calkins' patrol car and having seen him arresting Terrance with their own eyes, the pressure was on for him to explain what in the world was going on and how all of these people, independent of one another, could have witnessed him doing this when he was saying it literally never happened. Calkins suddenly, and some would say miraculously, said he did actually remember the interaction with Terrance, and his supervisor told him that he needed to file an incident report, possibly hoping that the whole thing would be easily explained and that everyone would be relieved to find Terrance and realize it was all just some big misunderstanding and a pretty big mistake on the officer's part, but not anything major or maybe lawsuit worthy. They definitely would have been wrong, though, if they thought that this was just a big misunderstanding, because after being ordered to submit a report, Calkins finally wrote one, and he said that he had first come into contact with Terrance Williams at approximately 12:15 p.m. on the afternoon of January 12, 2004, after noticing the vehicle was seemingly, quote, driving in distress, end quote. This would be the first point of contention because the cemetery employees all stated, every single one of them, that it happened much earlier at around 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. The witness statement seemed to make more sense because Terrance had been scheduled to be at his job at 10 that morning on that day, and he hadn't called his employer to tell him he wasn't coming or that he would be late at all, and Terrance definitely would have done that. This was a new job. Deputy Calkins claimed that he followed Terrance Williams' vehicle into the cemetery parking lot and that Terrance had asked him for a ride to the Circle K convenience store nearby because he said he was very late for his shift. Terrance didn't work at the Circle K, though. Deputy Calkins also claimed that Terrance had told him that the registration and other documents for the vehicle were in the glove compartment. He said that he gave Terrance a ride without first checking for the documents and gave him a ride so he wouldn't be late for work as a good faith gesture, figuring he could just come back and look through the documents later on. After dropping Terrance off and coming back to the vehicle, he said he saw that there were no documents in the glove compartment or anywhere else in the vehicle, and upon feeling very deceived, he called the Circle K and asked for Terrance on his work-issued cell phone. Allegedly, the clerk informed him over the phone that there was no one by that name who worked there, and the call was hung up. I haven't dealt with police in situations of arrest too many times, right? I have no criminal record, but I have had to deal with police before for other things. I have not ever heard of an officer being like, oh, absolutely, let me make sure you get to work on time or no later than you already are, and I don't have to fact check anything that you said beforehand, right? That does not seem reasonable to me and doesn't make sense. Now, has it happened ever in the history of policing? I'm sure maybe it has, but in 2004, I don't think that would have been the norm for an officer to just trust the word of some random person he pulled over who was driving in distress, meaning there was potential there for him to have been driving under the influence or having some kind of medical emergency, right? So driving in distress, he more than likely, or maybe protocol more than likely would have been like a field sobriety exam or a breathalyzer or something like that. But he just didn't do any of that and chose to drive Terrance to work instead. According to Deputy Calkins' report, he then decided to run the license plate, calling in the number and finding out that the plates were expired. However, further investigation into the statements made in the report showed that there was no evidence whatsoever to back up what Calkins had been claiming. None of it. The surveillance footage from that morning at the Circle K never showed either Stephen Calkins or Terrance Williams anywhere near that store, and the records from Calkins' business work cell phone showed no evidence of him having called the store at all either. Employees working their shifts at the convenience store on the morning in question also came up with no one who remembered seeing either man there or talking to any police officers on the phone. After all of this, still having received no real answers as to what happened to her son, Marcia filed a complaint against Deputy Calkins, and a strange new lead was developed due to this. A Mexican consultant in Miami, Florida, got in touch with Marcia and told her about an oddly similar case of a young man disappearing after having come into contact with Deputy Stephen Calkins. Through this contact, Marcia learned about Felipe Santos, a 24-year-old Mexican national who had been living in the United States illegally in nearby Immokalee, Florida. Felipe had been living there for 3 years at the time of his disappearance, and he had also been sending most of his money back home to his family in Mexico. Felipe was last seen on October 14, 2003 at approximately 6:30 in the morning. He had been driving to work with his two brothers when he got into a very minor car accident in Naples. It turned out that Deputy Stephen Calkins arrived on the scene and cited Felipe for reckless driving, driving without a license and insurance, and then placed him in the back of his patrol car. The last time Felipe Santos was seen, he was staring through the back window of Deputy Calkins' patrol car at his brothers as he was driven away from them. Later that same day, his boss contacted the sheriff's department in order to try to post Felipe's bail to get him out of jail, but he was told that no one named Felipe Santos had ever been booked. Stephen Calkins said that because Felipe was, quote, so polite and cooperative, end quote, he had decided not to arrest him after all. He changed his mind as they were driving to the police station, and that he had dropped him off at a nearby convenience store, the Circle K. Stephen Calkins said he drove off and left Felipe there at the Circle K, never having any contact with him again or knowing what became of him at all. It was unclear why the deputy would have left Felipe near the Circle K, as his job was nearby to where he had gotten into the accident, and his boss was already on the way to pick up him and his brothers when the deputy arrived there on the scene. The other driver who had been involved in the accident contradicted Deputy Calkins' report completely, stating that the deputy seemed very angry and severely agitated about the fact that Felipe was here illegally and could not show any documentation. The witness later said, quote, he just stated that he was tired of pulling people over who didn't have driver's licenses, end quote. Regardless of which statement is true, just like in Terrance Williams' case, there's no evidence at all that either Deputy Calkins or Felipe Santos were ever anywhere near the Circle K that morning, and surveillance certainly didn't pick them up in the parking lot at all. For nearly 2 hours after driving away with Felipe in the back of his patrol car, Stephen Calkins' whereabouts were unknown and he was unaccounted for. In the case of Felipe Santos, it took 2 whole weeks for the deputy to submit his incident report, and once he did, Felipe's family filed a missing persons report and a complaint against Stephen Calkins. However, on November 27, 2003, an internal investigation managed to clear Calkins of any wrongdoing. Felipe's wife, Apollonia Cruz Cortez, questioned the integrity of the investigation into not only his disappearance, but into Stephen Calkins' possible involvement in it. Her issues with the investigation were many, but her main concern was the fact that she had never been interviewed by a single investigator about her husband's disappearance. Further investigation into each case and what involvement, if any, Deputy Calkins had in them would turn up some disturbing evidence that something sinister had more than likely taken place. So, a recording of Deputy Calkins' call to dispatch requesting the tow of Terrance Williams' car was released, and it only served to cast further suspicion on him and revealed further conflicting statements. In the call, Calkins described the white Cadillac as blocking the road and abandoned. This one statement contradicted not only his own incident report, but also the statements of all of the witnesses who were working at the cemetery that day or who otherwise had business there and saw the deputy's interaction with Terrance, who later came forward. As we know, Stephen Calkins moved the vehicle out of the parking spot in the lot of the cemetery and to where it was in the road, where it was then blocking and obstructing traffic. Calkins was even heard joking with the dispatcher, saying, quote, "Maybe he's out there in the cemetery. He'll come back and his car will be gone." End quote. He could also be heard using unprofessional and very inappropriate language during the call, describing the vehicle as, quote, "a homey Cadillac," end quote, and also as, quote, "a piece of junk Cadillac," end quote. He was also accused of using an offensive accent that some would consider racist as he was speaking to the dispatcher. Think black scent. However, Deputy Calkins defended his words during the call and brushed it off as if he had been, quote, "just joking around with a coworker," end quote. Calkins also insisted that he'd only moved the vehicle in order to assist the tow company, and that he wasn't at all trying to make it look more like the vehicle had been abandoned. He claimed in the recording that the car was disabled, but Terrance's family had vehemently denied that fact. Not to mention, how would the deputy have been able to move the vehicle like he did if the car wasn't at least in some sort of working condition? Also, a family member later picked up the vehicle from the tow yard and drove it home without any problems. 20 minutes after he had the plates run and made all of the contradictory above-mentioned statements, Deputy Calkins called dispatch again and asked them to run the name Terrance Williams. This was around 1:12 p.m. on the 12th. When he did so, he gave an inaccurate birth date, and the date he gave was a known false birth date that Terrance was known to use and had given the police when he was arrested previously and for unrelated matters. Deputy Calkins stated in his original incident report before the phone calls to dispatch from that day were released that he didn't know Terrance's last name and had gotten no personal details from him while speaking to him or while driving him to the Circle K. So that is actually really important. He claimed that, one of the reasons he couldn't remember and also why this was no big deal, like he didn't know his last name. He didn't ask for his ID. He just knew his name was Terrance, and he only came up with that after the fact, and that he worked at the Circle K, or he said he worked at the Circle K. That is absolutely not true. He ran Terrance's license. Anyway, so after he called in to ask about Terrance at 1:12 p.m., his whereabouts were unknown and his time was unaccounted for a little over an hour, and some say for as long as 2 hours. That's the same length of time he was unaccounted for while he claimed to have been driving Felipe Santos to the Circle K as well. He claimed to have been doing other things, but there's no evidence or other documentation to corroborate any of those alleged activities. Because of all of the suspicion on him due to these two cases and how he was said to have conducted himself, Stephen Calkins took 3 polygraph tests with regards to what really happened on the days each of these 2 men went missing, right after having interactions with him while he was on official police duty. 1 test was inconclusive, 1 indicated he was telling the truth, and the 3rd indicated he was being deceptive. Because the person of interest in this instance was a law enforcement official, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the FBI were called in to work on the case to avoid any conflict of interest or any bias. Many various investigative techniques were used to figure out what was really going on and whether or not Calkins had done anything criminal in either case. These investigative methods included surreptitiously placing a GPS monitor on Stephen's vehicle, a full forensic investigation of his patrol car, and cadaver dogs being used to survey the area where his GPS was said to have gone on those days. However, none of these techniques turned up any further evidence into what really happened on those 2 fateful days to those 2 young men. Stephen Calkins was subsequently fired from the sheriff's department, and the official reason was that he gave conflicting statements about both missing persons cases and for being non-cooperative in both investigations. In 2009, Terrance Williams' family had declared him legally dead. Stephen Calkins left Florida in 2016, and a complete forensic search of his former home and property, where it stood, was conducted, but no human remains or any further clues into either case were ever uncovered. With no further information, let's briefly discuss some theories that have sprang up, as ever since 2012, these 2 cases have garnered national attention and have been featured on many true crime investigation shows. Tyler Perry, who had offered $200,000 of his own money for a reward for any useful information in connection with either or both cases, seemed to be very involved with the outcome of this. He also released a documentary called Never Seen Again in May of 2022 that addresses each disappearance and how both are connected, and the story was also featured on shows like Disappeared and Deadline, Crime with Tamron Hall. As of today, both cases remain unsolved, and no one has ever been charged in relation to any crime concerning either man's disappearance, and what became of both of them is still unknown. This is an absolute tragedy and travesty of justice. The theory mainly pushed by the sheriff's department was that both men just happened to have run off on their own accord after being spooked by their interaction with a police officer. It's said they did this to avoid their own troubles with the law. Felipe Santos was here illegally, he was undocumented, while Terrance Williams had warrants out for his arrest for unpaid child support. However, to this very day, both men's families are adamant that they didn't run away and that something bad had to have happened to them. Both families believe whatever happened to their loved one, Stephen Calkins, had something to do with it and that he knows the truth about what became of them. However, there's never been any actual evidence to back that claim up, or at least there's never been anything that would hold up in court for a murder conviction. There's no evidence that either man has ever been seen again since their initial interaction with Stephen Calkins, though, and they were both last seen alive in the back of his patrol car. Despite a few sightings here and there of the men, none have ever been substantiated, so I'm not even going to go into those. Another popular theory about what happened to these two men is called the Starlight Tour theory, and it's said to have originated in Saskatchewan, Canada. This is the practice of police officers driving individuals to the edge of town or outside of city limits and abandoning them to find their own way home as a sort of punishment for breaking the law in some minor way. This practice came to light in the year 2000 when a man named Daryl Knight, who was an Indigenous Canadian, reported that he had been picked up by police after leaving a party and was then driven to the edge of a rural town, let out of the patrol car, and left to find his own way home and to fend for himself in the middle of nowhere in the freezing cold. He survived after randomly finding a power plant nearby to where he was left, and he was able to find a security guard at the plant who then offered to help him get home. The very next day, another Indigenous man named Rodney Nastis was found near where Daryl Knight had been dropped off, but he hadn't been so lucky. Rodney was found frozen to the ground, deceased. A couple of weeks later, in the exact same area, yet another Indigenous man named Lawrence Wagner was found deceased under some pretty strange circumstances. According to Saskatoon's new police chief at the time, a man named Russ Sabo, there's evidence that these kinds of random drop-offs being used as punishment go all the way back to at least the 1970s in that specific area. The Collier County Sheriff's Department pushed the theory that both men ran off because they were spooked and didn't want to deal with pending legal issues, but some people who are familiar with the cases of Felipe Santos and Terrance Williams believe that Calkins could have been using the Starlight Tour technique to try and teach the men a lesson, only to have them disappear and for it to have gone horribly wrong. For me, that is just far too coincidental. I can see doing it with someone like maybe Felipe Santos. He was undocumented, get out of our town type of BS, right? Or even maybe for Terrance, where it's like, you shouldn't be driving, so now you're going to walk. But for both of them, and for it to go wrong, and for the men never to show back up in both cases, And if that was the case, Calkins could have just come out and kind of said that, or he could have come out and directly said that, because at least then he's giving an answer, right? He's not just saying, well, I don't know, I dropped them off the Circle K, even though there's no evidence of that. Like, it would be much more reasonable and more likely to be believed if he simply said, yeah, I did the Starlight Tour thing, I'm really sorry, I can't believe this happened in both cases, I'll never do it again, slap on the wrist, yada, yada, yada. In this theory, the Starlight Tour technique theory, the only wrongdoing on Stephen's part would be not following protocol and submitting false information once he realized the men were missing and didn't know what to say, because leaving people that you've arrested at city limits to fend for themselves isn't legally what you're supposed to be doing to uphold the law. But again, much less suspicious than what actually happened. There's also been a number of different podcasts who have explored these cases, and the theory of them having been dropped off in the Everglades only to die of exposure or some other tragedy has been explored. However, the NPR podcast in 2023 called The Last Ride points out that from where they were each picked up in or near Naples, Stephen Calkins would not have had enough time to drive all the way out to the Everglades in either instance, even with the 1 to 2 hours he was unaccounted for after putting the men in the back of his patrol car. A former Collier County Sheriff's employee, who chose to remain anonymous for obvious reasons, said that there were and had to have been additional people besides just Stephen Calkins who were involved in the disappearance of these two men, or at the very least, in the cover-up of whatever happened to them. However, there's been no evidence to support this either. It's been said time and again that Stephen Calkins, upon his being terminated from the sheriff's office and due to several lawsuits filed against him from the families of the victims, had to agree to never work for any kind of law enforcement again, though I couldn't find any evidence that that's actually the case either. And in fact, last I heard, he is working somewhere else. But I don't know if that one particular detail is true or not. Guys, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below, please. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me. Spread the love by sharing this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave at least 7 characters in the comments and help your girl out. Check out the description box for important links, ways to donate to the channel, PayPal, Cash App, my Amazon wish list gift link. Also, in the description box, you will find links to all 14 of my books on Kindle and paperback on Amazon, and then the Audible link. Those are a lot of links, and I'm the first to admit I may have missed one or two. So if you just want to see all of my books, go to Amazon and type in Gemma Jade Books. If you would like an autographed copy of any of those books for any and all correspondence, to send in your own listener encounters, stories, for any and all correspondence with me, please email me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Check me out on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. TikTok specifically, I'm slowly climbing the ladder to 10K, but I'm not even at 2K yet as of the time I'm filming this on July 20th. So please, guys, help me get to 10K so I can be monetized over there and have another source of income. I really, really do appreciate it. If you can't donate money to PayPal and Cash App, there are so many other ways you can support me and help me grow and help me bring money in at the very least. I just appreciate you guys very, very much. Thank you for all of the support on the TikToks and YouTube Shorts, which I'm a lot easier able to do in the summer when I can't maybe work as much. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today you're amazing, you got this, okay? Believe in yourself like I believe in you. Always go in grace, smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time. Mwah! Bye.